So I fully agree with that there has to be a political solution also. There's different ones in Iraq and in Syria. In Iraq, the big issue was that ISIS was able to make common cause with the Sunni Arab tribes and the tribal militias because the former Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki had been ruling in a sectarian manner that favored the Shia Arabs over the Sunni Arabs. He had arrested some prominent officials, thrown some people out of office or out of militarily prominent positions on trumped-up charges. So one thing that the Obama administration really pushed for was a new Iraqi government that was supposed to be more inclusive. And so there's a new prime minister appointed in September, a body, and he's been saying the right things. But as of yet, the Sunni Arab Iraqis haven't really flipped. So as long as they're working with ISIS, or at least some of them are willing to work with ISIS, then it's going to be very hard to push ISIS out of the Sunni Arab areas of Iraq.
Just because they've already formed those relationships.
Right. That I don't think they necessarily like them, meaning the Sunni Arab Iraqis liked ISIS all that much.
Sure.
It was just enemy of my enemy, that they couldn't take the persecution from the government anymore and made common cause with someone who was fighting the government.
And just so I have it straight in my own head, these are the Sunni Iraqis.
Sunni Arab Iraqis.
Sunni
right.
Arab, okay.
Yeah, the Kurds are mostly Sunnis,
right,
but
okay.
they're ethnically different.
Right.
Syria is a much bigger problem. And that ISIS was able to grow in the Syrian civil war, which has been going on for about 3 years, has killed over 150,000 people by now, and displaced millions, with refugees going to all different countries and also moving internally in Syria. And the problem is that that ongoing civil war creates an environment that is conducive to international terrorist groups or insurgent groups like ISIS, like the smaller Khorasan group that the U.S. bombed at the very start of the military action, like al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, along with a bunch of other groups. So as long as the Syrian civil war is raging, it's not really clear how ISIS can be defeated, because air power alone can't defeat an insurgent group like ISIS. Someone needs to take control on the ground. In Iraq, the hope is that the Kurds and the Kurdish Peshmerga, their militia, will take control of Iraqi Kurdistan, where they live, that the Iraqi military and some Shia militias will take control in the Arab Shia areas, especially around the capital, and that the Sunni Arabs can be flipped and will take control of their areas on the ground once coalition airstrikes weaken them. But there's no one who can really do that in Syria. The one group besides the Syrian government that has really demonstrated an ability to hold territory in Syria is ISIS.
This kind of battle is obviously a lot different than any kind of war we've seen before.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the talk has been about, if they would approve action and things like that. Are we past the period where it makes sense for Congress to go out and declare a war and declare it then over? Or is this something, like you said, it's not something that can be fixed with airstrikes? You can't kind of armchair quarterback it.
Yeah, well, first, we haven't declared war since the Second World War. But to make it more of a real war, I guess, to introduce U.S. ground forces, currently the U.S. plan is for Syria to train and arm members of the Free Syrian Army, the moderate Syrian opposition, or relatively moderate group. The Congress authorized $500 million to train about 5,000 of them, mostly in Saudi Arabia, also in Jordan, and that their plan currently is to take a year. Now, to put that in perspective, the United States spent the better part of a decade training the Iraqi army, which numbers about 270,000 soldiers, and they got pushed back pretty badly by ISIS. So I'm not sure how 5,000 troops, 5,000 Free Syrian Army fighters being trained for a year is going to be the decisive force. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because having people that are more friendly to American interests or more moderate in general fighting against ISIS in Syria would be beneficial, but they're not going to be able to take control. So the options are leave the Syrian civil war burning, try to just push ISIS out of Iraq and contain them in Syria, or some sort of international coalition that invades Syria like the U.S.-occupied Iraq with, 100,000 something soldiers and tries to execute counterinsurgency, remove the government, and basically stay there for a decade. And I don't think anybody wants that, or at least very few people want that, certainly not the president.
But this kind of halfway measure, trying to train folks and then let them do it by themselves.
It's not going to work. That Obama said that the U.S. goal is to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. And I am very skeptical that that will be possible without real military forces on the ground in Syria. Now, that doesn't have to be the U.S. It could be, for example, Turkey. But Turkey doesn't seem to want to do it, especially not as long as Assad is still in power. And it could, in theory, be Assad, be the Syrian government, but the Obama administration has said Assad has to go and doesn't want to make common cause with him. And Turkey, who's a NATO ally and might get involved in a coalition, also does not want to make common cause with Assad. In fact, made getting rid of Assad a condition of them becoming a greater part of the fight against ISIS.
That was one of the things that Joni and Ernst threw out, is that before doing anything, you need to pull other people in and create this coalition. You kind of just talk through how the coalition doesn't seem like it's going to exist.
Right.
I mean, can it be other European powers?
In theory, sure. And the British and French forces have been helping out with airstrikes in Iraq. They show no interest in putting ground troops in Syria. And I'm not too surprised on that. There is a coalition because besides just some European allies, there's also some Arab allies, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and with material support, Qatar, who have all agreed to openly fight against ISIS, join the coalition. So while most of the military force is American, the fact that these countries, especially a prominent Sunni Arab country like Saudi Arabia, would stand up and say we're fighting ISIS is very important politically. It undermines ISIS's arguments. They're trying to say, here come the Western imperialists to just take over Muslim lands again, and they're calling themselves the Islamic State, claiming to represent all Muslims, or at least all Sunni Muslims, and with a bunch of prominent Sunni Arab countries on the other side of the conflict, that really weakens that argument that they're trying to make. So that part's valuable. But no one seems especially interested in getting involved with what would be a long and bloody ground war against a bunch of fighters that seem quite capable. And even if the ISIS fighters were defeated, there's still the mess of Syria that cultivates more people just like them.
Sure. If we could kind of step into ISIS for a little bit. I mean, and this is almost more out of my curiosity than anything else. How is it that they are so much more effective than Al-Qaeda, who has said that even ISIS is a little bit more extreme than they are? But also, not only are they more extreme, but now they're pulling people from Britain and from the United States and attracting them to go fight. So not only are they, farther on the spectrum, but now they're getting people who live in the Western world to suit up with them. How does that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be perfectly honest, I know I'm probably not supposed to say this, but we don't fully know. We're not entirely sure. That there are a couple of things we do know about ISIS. One is that they have a lot of experienced fighters, people who had fought against the U.S. in Iraq, probably a few people who fought against the U.S. in Afghanistan, some people who fought against the Russians in Chechnya. So a number who have had quite a bit of experience fighting these type of insurgent conflicts. So what that also means is not only are they more experienced and more tactically knowledgeable, but they also, by being religious, are not particularly afraid to die. So if you honestly believe that when you die you're going to heaven and you're going to be rewarded, that makes you perhaps more willing to take risks than people who are less convinced that that's what's going to happen to them. So they early on proved to be among the best fighters in the Syrian civil conflict, that both recruiting among Syrians and also a lot of foreign fighters that wanted to fight against Assad. Then they gradually got more power by capturing weapons, by being on the front lines of various rebel assaults on Syrian military installations, and were able to capture a lot of equipment and also get more recruits by people like a winner. And so anyone fighting against the Syrian government found ISIS to be maybe not ideologically appealing, but at least impressive with their tactical success.
Sure.
Then ISIS was able to push into Iraq, and that's where they seemed to really jump up a level, in part by making common cause with the Sunni Arabs that were angry at the Iraqi government. And that includes things like well-established militias that had previously fought against al-Qaeda in Iraq, and which included actually some of the people who are now in ISIS were in that group, fled to Syria, and also formed al-Nusra, formed some others. But so those Sunni Arab tribal militias are experienced also. They include some former Iraqi military officers under Saddam Hussein. And in particular, ISIS was able to capture a lot of money and equipment, especially when they took the city of Mosul, which is the second largest Iraqi city. And they captured a lot of equipment that the U.S. had given the Iraqi army.
Is there any idea for how much of their equipment did ultimately come from the U.S. in the first place?
Not precisely, but probably a lot. And if not from the U.S., a lot of it ultimately came from Russia. That doesn't mean that Russia gave it to them. It means that Russia, at some point, probably sold it to the Syrian government, and ISIS captured it from them, or they bought it on the black market at the very start. But at this point, probably most of their weaponry, I'd say especially the heavy weaponry, like tanks or armored personnel carriers, ultimately came from either Iraq or Syria, who in turn probably got most of it from the U.S. or Russia.
So, I mean, it really is kind of a ragtag group that's now incredibly well armed.
Yes, although, I mean, I don't know if I'd characterize them as ragtag because they've been so impressive. You know, I don't want to give them a compliment.
Yeah.
That's, you know what I mean, impressive militarily in taking territory. That the Kurdish Peshmerga had a reputation of being a really well-disciplined and talented fighting force, and ISIS handed them a lot of defeats, being able to push into Iraqi Kurdistan and even advance on the the Kurdish capital of Erbil, which was one of the major things that prompted the United States to get involved in the first place. That there were the journalist beheadings, which galvanized a lot of American opinion against ISIS, but also the way that ISIS pushed so successfully into Kurdistan against the Peshmerga made the United States more willing to act because we have a long-standing alliance with the Kurds, going back to when they were living under Saddam Hussein, and the U.S. maintained a no-fly zone over Iraqi Kurdistan. So the fact that ISIS, which at the time was estimated to have at most 30,000 fighters, and they were spread out with a lot still in Syria and other places in Iraq, were able to succeed against the Kurdish Peshmerga, which had an estimated 100, maybe as many as 150,000 men-at-arms, and had a reputation of being quite good, and got, frankly, trounced, was really impressive. So I can tell you as a scholar of insurgency, I look forward to, in the future, being able to really analyze what ISIS did and how they were able to succeed tactically, and that'll help us learn lessons for how to defeat groups like that in the future.
Is part of the reason why we don't know just because this is the first time we've seen someone be so effective in an insurgent type of battle, or?
Yes and no. The big difference, of course, between ISIS succeeding now and Iraqi insurgent groups when the U.S. was there was the United States had over 100,000 highly trained troops in the country and was covering it with all sorts of surveillance and working with the Iraqis. So it's very different to be a group like ISIS first fighting in a civil war in Syria, which has many different sides, which means a lot of opportunity to take advantage of the situation, and then fighting in Iraq, where they had to deal with a Iraqi army where a lot of units were Shia Arabs that didn't particularly care about protecting the Sunni Arab areas, or the Kurdish forces, which we now know hadn't really been re-equipped in perhaps a couple decades. Very different from Iraqi insurgents trying to fight the United States. So we don't know how a group like ISIS would do against a well-trained, highly equipped, technologically advanced professional army like the United States is.
Because they've never actually gone.
They haven't actually had to fight one.
Wow. I've heard about the Kurds that they do have that incredible reputation for being good fighters, but a lot of that is from older battles, and that a lot of their forces now are a lot younger and maybe haven't earned that or just don't have the experience. Is that also maybe part of the problem?
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. That militaries get reputations in part by success that they're able to pass down. It means that they're also good at training. You know, they're good at passing on different techniques to new commanders. But also the fact that the Kurds have been a fairly stable area, the most stable area of Iraq over the last, at this point, couple decades, really, or definitely since the fall of Saddam in 2003. And their equipment seems to be fairly antiquated, that, you know, they're using bolt-action rifles in some cases instead of machine guns, that they are fighting, you know, guys with guns as opposed to things like armored personnel carriers or helicopters. Not that ISIS has helicopters, but, you know, the U.S. uses some prominently. And so, yeah, that has a lot to do with it. So, but it's a combination of their reputation has definitely been harmed because they couldn't pass that on, but it's also been revealed that they're weaker than people thought, in part because their equipment is older.
Right. You talked a little bit before about some of the options, letting, you know, kind of pushing them out of Iraq, letting Syria burn, or invading Syria, which, you know, would have obvious, you know, bloody consequences. I mean, is that the answer then? In that it's going to be really unpleasant to get rid of Syria one way or the other? Is that?
Yeah, it's going to. I guess a good way to put it is this is probably going to get worse before it gets better. That I don't see any good path whereby the Free Syrian Army, the moderate rebels that the United States is going to train, are going to be able to take control from ISIS on the ground in Syria, even if U.S. air power weakens their positions. And just recently, I mean, actually I think probably still going on right now, ISIS is moving on a Kurdish town in the north near the Turkish border called Kobani, and demonstrating quite a bit of success. And U.S. airstrikes slowed them down a little bit, but Turkish ground forces don't want to engage. The Kurds there are becoming overwhelmed. And if there isn't someone who can fight ISIS on the ground, they're not really going to be defeated. And additionally problematic, the Free Syrian Army doesn't really want to fight ISIS that much. They don't like them, they've squabbled with them, but ISIS is fighting the Assad government in Syria. The Free Syrian Army is fighting the Assad government in Syria. They're not all that eager to take out the organization that has been most successful at pushing back Assad's forces. So I don't see anybody who is capable of taking control on the ground in Syria besides some sort of international coalition of ground troops that would almost certainly have to include the U.S., or maybe the Syrian government that no one seems to want to work with, and with good reason. They've been quite brutal against civilians.
Sure.
So, yeah, I think that the most likely outcome, at least in the short term, as long as the U.S. is resistant to introduce ground forces, which seems to be a strong principle of the current president, that the best the U.S. can do is push ISIS out of Iraq and not defeat them in Syria.
But it seems like some of the things that you're talking about that might ultimately lead to wiping out ISIS would be incredibly more drastic than measures that are taken so far.
Yes.
Do you think that domestically it would be possible to do what needs to be done?
Probably not.
Okay.
The choice is going to be between not defeating ISIS or escalating. And the American people seem supportive of air power, but very hesitant to introduce ground forces. Obama seems very hesitant, explicitly said that he won't get the U.S. involved with a ground war in Iraq. That's already started to change a little. The U.S. introduced Apache helicopters, which are not exactly boots on the ground, but they are boots in the air. You know, it's not just planes firing missiles. And Martin Dempsey, the chair of the Joint Chiefs, has said that the U.S. advisors, the 1,000 troops, 1,000-plus forces that the United States introduced to train and advise the Iraqi army, really should get involved with the units that they're advising when they go into combat. that it will be very beneficial for those units' morale. It'll really hurt if their advisor and the one who also can communicate with U.S. aircraft to instruct U.S. aircraft to hit certain targets says, okay, you guys go ahead, I'm just going to hang back, and, good luck. So that'll be more of a combat role than promised. But the other thing to consider is that the next president will almost certainly be more hawkish than Obama, because Republicans are traditionally more hawkish than Democrats, and with the exception of someone who's more isolationist like Rand Paul, all of the people who are currently discussing running for president on the Republican ticket would be more hawkish, more aggressive in foreign policy. Hillary Clinton has criticized Obama as not dealing with ISIS soon enough, not dealing with the Civil War soon enough, and has been more hawkish than him. So except in what I think is a very unlikely possibility that a Democrat who is as reluctant to use force as Obama both wins the nomination and then gets elected, we're going to have a next president who is not as reluctant, and that president will face the choice of get more involved, actually try to destroy ISIS with ground forces, or basically let it go and see what happens.
What is it like to see this kind of thing in the Senate race, which is obviously, much short of a presidential race, but, this is obviously getting one of the races that's getting the most attention across the country. It's obviously one of the biggest international issues that, is just going on right now.
I think it's made an interesting wrinkle on the Senate race, that it's a topic that probably neither candidate really prepared for in advance. They couldn't have expected it, that they seem to, both Braley and Ernst seem to want to run primarily on domestic issues, on things like taxes, healthcare, and the like, and now have almost been forced to discuss it. They both seem to have some relation with military issues, that I know Braley's on the Veterans Affairs Committee, that Ernst has served in the National Guard for a long time and was stationed in Kuwait for 2 years. But neither of them seem to be especially a foreign policy expert. And so I think it's interesting to see them have to relate to the issues. I don't think many Iowans are going to pick which of the two they vote for based on their stance on ISIS.
Sure. Really, the kind of last question for you. I could go all day with it.
Sure. I'm happy to. Yeah.
But Ruth really was talking about how part of the goal is to convince people back home that whatever action is taken is the right action to take. And you're talking about how challenging it would be to make some of the moves popular. How important is it to, if you're going to use the advisors in a more combat role than previously thought, to get people on board with it?
I'd say morally it's important in that the U.S. is a democracy and we want the government to be in sync with the public and wouldn't want it to go against what the public wants. Practically, the U.S. doesn't really need much public support to the U.S. government to conduct military missions. If you total up all the people who serve in the military or their families, you only have a few percentage points of the population. With increasing use of drones and other robotic systems, there's even less of a need to get popular support because it's only robots, machines that could be destroyed, not people who are going to be killed. And one thing we saw from both the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War is that there were times during Iraq, for example, where the war started out with over 50% support, but declined pretty shortly thereafter and never got above 50 again. And yet President Bush still ordered a troop surge in which America escalated, introduced 30,000 more troops, and also switched strategy to counterinsurgency. But that was done without popular support, and by most measures it succeeded. So there wasn't really anything standing in the way in terms of public disapproval. On the other hand, I think it's likely that Obama beat Clinton for the nomination in 2008, in part because he had been a vocal opponent of the Iraq War, and Clinton had voted for it in the beginning. And a lot of Democratic voters in 2008, Democratic primary voters, were strongly opposed to the Iraq War, and so that helped Obama gain support. So it can Practically, it can matter with elections, especially president, but the president doesn't really need public approval to go to war.
Sure. Is the future of this drone technology and unmanned aircraft, in just in terms of getting people out of places where the public doesn't want them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the big advantages of drones is that there's no human risk. So, to give you kind of a broad historical view on this, the thing that undermined the U.S. war effort in Vietnam was, in large part, the draft. So the United States hadn't succeeded, which of course can be frustrating, and some people didn't agree with the war in the first place, so they would oppose it. But a lot of people coming back in body bags, including people who didn't volunteer to go in the first place, really helped turn the public against the war and then pretty much force or strongly influence the government to stop it. After that, the U.S. didn't have a draft, had a professional army only, and it also helped with fewer casualties. But still, there were soldiers coming home in body bags, that these were things from Iraq or Afghanistan that the Bush administration tried to keep off the news because they were aware that Americans would be upset at American soldiers dying without a very clear cause. So something like responding to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans are willing to accept casualties, understand it's a war. Fighting in Iraq after weapons of mass destruction weren't found, after Saddam had been out of power for a while, some people began to think maybe it's not worth it in the same way. With drones, that's not an issue. There are no body bags, so the public doesn't feel the costs of war almost at all. And not only that, robotic planes are much cheaper than manned planes. They don't need to carry a person or keep a person alive. They don't need to carry the oxygen. They can also remain in the air much longer. You know, they don't need to eat or sleep or pee or anything else that a human pilot has to do. So they're able to hover more. They're able to wait for a more opportune moment to shoot. They're not afraid of getting fired back at. So they'll wait. And obviously, the U.S. has some very talented pilots, but even the most talented person can't stay flying for, say, 24 hours uninterrupted and be at peak condition. A robot can. So this both makes them more useful and also a way to separate the public and the military when it comes to fighting wars. So if nobody's dying and it's cheaper, I don't think most Americans will really care. That in that case, they'll say, okay, well, if you believe that it's helping our security, it's not costing much, so why not? As opposed to when American soldiers are dying and they say, okay, I know you think that this helps our security, but I don't think it's worth it giving all these people that are dying as a result.
Do you think there's just a initial Big Brother fear to get over, like the fact, just the drones and unmanned aircraft idea? Do you think that's something that will go away? The opposition of it just because it is a drone? Or do you think that'll always be kind of an undercurrent in opposition to using them at all?
A little of both.
Yeah.
That the surveillance capabilities mean that people can be watched more at all times. That's not too different from things like, say, security cameras all over big cities, New York especially, and Washington to a lesser extent, but it's just covered in security cameras. So people are being watched more. On the other hand, a lot of times new technologies, people get a little wary of the newness. They're not sure what they can do, but after a while they prove a track record and nobody notices. So things like, say, automated elevators. Without the elevator operator in there, people used to be very nervous. Oh no, what's going to happen? Now nobody thinks about it. Autopilot in aircraft. When you're flying a passenger jet, a lot of the time it's on autopilot, and who even thinks about it anymore? So similar thing, when over time drones prove that they are equally successful, that things like, say, the Terminator or other nightmare scenarios don't come true, I think people will become more accustomed to them. That doesn't necessarily mean that people will become accepting of increased government surveillance. But then again, we live in an age of social media where people broadcast all sorts of stuff about themselves. And so younger people seem more comfortable with more information about them being known than older people do, which means as those younger people become older and someone who grew up with the internet always being around, and especially with Facebook or any other social media platform always being around, won't care as much.